Hi there, welcome or welcome back. I'm Emily, and it's time to put all the finishing touches on my 2025 reading journal and take a look through the whole thing. The last things I have to set up in my reading journal are all my end of year pages, and then I also have to finish up something that goes at the beginning of my reading journal. First up is this year in review page. I haven't done anything like this before, but I ended up reading a couple less books than I wanted in December, and I had already started sketching out all my stats pages and didn't want to redo all that work. So I added this in to those extra couple pages I had. Otherwise, I would have just had to tape them together or left them blank. I also had a really weird year with reading. I read a ton in the first few months of the year, but then I almost stopped reading for like 2.5 months and then swung pretty drastically between reading consistently and not reading for weeks on end throughout the rest of the year, which was quite odd. I also did not read nearly as many audiobooks as usual, especially in the second half of the year. I don't really know why. I've just been uninterested in audiobooks lately, but I would definitely like to figure it out soon so that I can get my reading back up. As far as the actual setup of this page, I kept it super simple with just the title and a border. The title is in the same font as all my start of year pages from the beginning of the journal. I always try to tie all of my start of year and end of year pages together aesthetically to kind of bookend the entire journal. For this font, it is very storybook-esque, and I used a gold paint pen to do the actual letters, and then outlined those with a fine liner along with the flowers and dots and swirls and everything. Okay, moving along, since that page isn't too exciting and is more just a journaling page to let me get my thoughts out, let's get into all my end of year statistics. I'm a huge lover of statistics about my reading, so I really love to capture all the info I'm tracking in my reading tracker in my reading journal. I do track stats monthly, but my end of year stats are usually much more in depth and usually end up taking 4 whole spreads or 8 pages, whereas my end of month stats only take up 1 spread or 2 pages. So I definitely track a lot more that I think aren't super interesting from month to month, since there isn't usually a ton of data month to month. For this setup, I'm doing the same title as the previous page, just for the overall page, and then I'll use that font one more time, but this style takes up a lot of space, so if I tried to do this for every single graph, I would very quickly run out of space. Instead, I'm just going to do the graph headers in regular cursive with the same gold paint pen. As far as the graphs go, I'm going to color in all my graphs with the same colors I've been using for my yearly pages at the front of my journal to fill in my page tracker and book tracker and everything. I don't really usually do very much decoration on the stats pages because they're pretty packed, but my start of the year theme was like a mushroom fairy storybook kind of theme, so these colors go along with that. The stats on this first spread are source, aka where the book came from, ratings, genres, and length. For the year, I read 36 books from the library, 11 books that I purchased, 5 books from Libro FM, 5 books that I was gifted, 5 books from book boxes, 4 books from Kindle Unlimited, which were the New Haven series books, 2 advanced reader copies, 1 pre-ordered book, and 1 special edition. For ratings, I read 16 books, I rated 5 stars, 11 books, I rated 4.5 stars, 20 books, I rated 4 stars, 9 books, I rated 3.5 stars, 10 books, I rated 3 stars, 3 books, I rated 2.5 stars, and 1 book, I rated 2 stars, giving me an average over the whole year of 4.02. I'm not super stingy with my high ratings, as you can tell, and I'm usually pretty good about picking books that I like based on the synopsis and vibes, and if I don't like them, I usually DNF them, so the books that I finish usually end up having a pretty high rating overall. For the genres I read mostly romance, fantasy, and horror, which is no surprise to me. Those are always my top 3 genres, with some mix-up from year to year in what was my top 2nd and 3rd. For length, the longest book I read this year was The Jasad Crown, which is the 2nd book in the Scorched Throne duology, and the shortest book I read this year was The 6 Deaths of the Saint, which is a short story. The majority of the books I read were in the 300 to 400 page range, with it tapering out in either direction from there. One of my goals for next year is to read more books that are longer because I didn't read any books over 700 pages this year, and I definitely have quite a few books on my shelves and TBR that are over that, and I would really like to get back into the habit of reading those. Moving into the next page, the graphs on this next page are going to be publisher, publication year, age demographic, and format. And then I also do a series of graphs on a couple of different criteria I keep track of for all of my books. So I track how many books made me cry throughout the year, how many books I reread throughout the year, how many series versus standalones I read, and then for the books that are part of a series, whether those books are a continuation of the series or if they are the start of a series. For this spread, I'm not doing a big title and I'm just doing the smaller headers for the different graphs since these kind of all fall within the end of year statistics category. For publisher, in my tracker, I keep track of both the highest level Big Five type of publisher, along with all of the individual imprints. But for my reading journal, I'm just going to write down the higher level publisher and not the imprint, since I think that is more interesting information. I read one book from Amazon. Unfortunately, The Six Deaths of the Saint is an Amazon exclusive story. 6 books from Hachette, 5 books from HarperCollins, 15 indie books, which includes both indie publishers and self-published books, 16 books from Macmillan, 24 books from Penguin Random House, and 3 books from Simon & Schuster. For publication year, my graph always skews towards recent years, but something surprising this year was the average. The past couple of years, my average publication year has always been the previous year, so usually for 2025, the average would have been 2024, but this year, my average was 2020, so that was interesting. I think I read a bit higher quantity of older books this year than I usually do, which these books aren't really that old by any means, but they're not as recent as I usually read. The oldest book I read this year was published in 1962, so again, not that old, but I'm hoping to read at least 6 classics next year, so hopefully I can read some older books next year as well. For my little random trackers, 14 books made me cry, 4 books were rereads, 26 books were part of a series, and 15 that were part of a series were a continuation of the series. For age demographic, 54 of the books I read were adult, 1 was new adult, and 15 were young adult. For format, 13 books were hardcover, 7 books were paperback, 28 were digital, 19 were audio, and 3 were multi, which means I either tandem or immersion read them, or I switched formats while reading. Next up, we have the pages I use for tracking the representation and diversity of the books I'm reading. Again, no titles on the page overall, even though I probably could have added one since these are all kind of under the same umbrella, but I ended up just doing the individual graph headers. On the left-hand page, we have all the types of LGBTQIA plus rep in all the books I read. 44 of the 70 books had at least one queer character or relationship in them. The first graph is for relationships, which the majority of the books that had queer relationships had sapphic relationships. 31 of the books I read had sapphic relationships, 9 had Achillean relationships, 2 had relationships featuring characters on the spectrum of asexuality, and 3 had poly relationships in them. The middle chart is for identities, which I had a pretty even spread across different identities. 12 books featured gay characters, 11 books featured lesbian characters, 18 books featured M-spec characters, and 8 books featured a spec character. The last chart is for gender identity. 7 books included trans characters, 9 books featured non-binary characters, and 4 books featured gender fluid characters. On the right-hand page, I have both my BIPOC representation breakdown and my disability representation breakdown. 45 of the books I read this year had BIPOC characters, 18 books had Black characters, 15 books had East Asian characters, 9 books had South Asian characters, 9 books had MENA characters, 8 books had Latina characters, 2 books had Indigenous characters, 1 book featured Southeast Asian characters, and 1 book featured Pacific Islander characters. 26 books I read this year had disabled characters, 16 books featured characters with emotional or psychiatric disabilities, 8 books featured neurodivergent characters, 6 books featured characters with physical disabilities, 3 books had characters with invisible or undiagnosed disabilities, and 2 books had characters with sensory disabilities. Onto my final stats pages. This is the one other page that I decided to add a title to because this left-hand side is all about the authors. I do the same little singular bars to track a couple different things and then use the donut charts for author gender breakdown and author race breakdown. 28 of the authors I read this year were queer, 11 of the authors were disabled, 18 of the authors were not American, and 5 of the authors were from non-Western countries. For the gender breakdown, 54 of the authors were women, 6 authors were men, and 12 authors were non-binary. For racial breakdown, 32 authors were white, 15 were Black, 10 were East Asian, 5 were Latine, 3 were MENA, 3 were Southeast Asian, 2 were Indigenous, 1 was South Asian, and 1 was Pacific Islander. Finally, the last page is my stats per month graph featuring all my totals as well. These graphs really showcase my super weird spikes I had throughout the year. In total, I read 70 books this year and hard DNF'd 4 and read a total of 24,718 pages. And that is all of the stats I have for the year. Now it's time to jump back to the front of the journal to fill out my book bracket for the year. I ended up switching my stats around a bit after June, so I wrote down my favorite book from each month for the second half of the year, which was really nice. So the selection process was really easy for those ones. The selection process was a bit harder for some of the months in the first half of the year, though. For each of those months, I just picked out all the 5-star reads I had, eliminated any nonfiction reads because I like this to be more about my fiction reads in general, and it seems more fair to pit all fiction books against each other since it's easier to gauge my enjoyment of the books versus how important it is. For January, Pet was my only 5-star read, so that one was pretty easy to select. In February, I had 2 5-star reads, but one of those was The Message, which is nonfiction, so the clear selection was The Maid and the Crocodile. And then in March, this was the really hard one. In March, I had 4 5-star reads, and none of them were nonfiction. Those were Don't Let the Forest In, Here We Go Again, The Adventures of Amina al-Sarafi, and The Spirit Bares Its Teeth. I pretty immediately eliminated Here We Go Again because that one is purely romance, whereas the other 3 are either fantasy or horror, and a 5-star romance is a little easier to obtain than a 5-star fantasy or a 5-star horror, if that makes sense. So then between the other 3, Don't Let the Forest In and The Spirit Bares Its Teeth are both horror. So I kind of narrowed down based on which of those 2 I liked better, and I liked The Spirit Bares Its Teeth better. I was just more engaged throughout the entire story, and I'm just a big fan of Andrew Joseph White. Deciding between The Adventures of Amina al-Sarafi and The Spirit Bares Its Teeth was super hard for me, but in the end, I went with Amina al-Sarafi, and I think mostly what swayed me over was I think I loved them both, but Amina al-Sarafi is for sure my favorite book that Shannon Chakraborty has written, but The Spirit Bares Its Teeth is not my favorite Andrew Joseph White book that I've read. For April, I didn't actually have any 5-star reads, but of Monsters and Mainframes was the very clear winner because I gave that one 4.5 stars, and the only other book I read in April was my lowest rated book of the year. For May, I only read 2 books, and Great Big Beautiful Life was the only one of those 2 that was 5 stars. And finally, in June, I only had 1 5-star read, but that read was actually nonfiction, so I had to eliminate it based on my rules for this. So the next best was 4.5 from The Empress of Salt and Fortune. Okay, I'm going to rapid fire between the other 6 months now, since I didn't have to agonize over these while I was actually filling it out. July went to The Bread Test, August went to When Among Crows, September went to The Jasad Crown, October went to The Six Deaths of the Saint, November went to The Berry Pickers, and December went to A Witch's Guide to Magical Innkeeping. Okay, now pitting these against each other for quarter 1, I picked The Maid and the Crocodile. I think this was actually the hardest choice to make across this whole thing. If I were to rank these 3 across the whole year, I think they would all make it in the top 6 for sure, so pitting them all directly against each other straight away was tough. In the end, The Maid and the Crocodile has stuck with me the most, I think. It was so beautiful and romantic, and the themes were beautifully done, and I think Jordan Ifweko has an amazing writing style. Pet and The Adventures of Amina al-Sarafi are both also incredible, but I think the style of The Maid and the Crocodile is really my favorite of the 3, and that's just what pushed it over the edge. For quarter two, I picked Of Monsters and Mainframes, which was kind of a shock because technically I rated Great Big Beautiful Life higher than this. But again, it's easier for a romance to get 5 stars out of me, and in my brain, it feels more equivalent to a 4.5 in other genres. And Of Monsters and Mainframes has stuck with me the whole year and is definitely the one I would most excitedly and readily recommend of these three. It was so unique and fun, and I loved the experience of reading it, especially. Quarter three was another tricky one because we had When Among Crows against the Jasad Crown. The bride test got tossed out of the mix pretty immediately because it is, again, a romance and also was only rated 4.5 stars and not 5. And right after I read The Jasad Crown, I thought it was going to be my favorite book of the year, but the longer it's been since I've read the book, the more I've had some critiques of it that I've thought of. None of them are really big enough to bring my rating down because I just enjoyed the experience of reading it so much, and I think it's an incredible book and it made me very emotional, but I don't think it's as perfect anymore. And When Among Crows just felt perfect to me, and the fact it was able to feel perfect in so few pages just snuck it in over The Jasad Crown. Finally, for quarter four, The Six Deaths of the Saint ended up being kind of an easy pick between the three. The story just packs such a punch, and it's so unique in the way it tells the story, and the other two really couldn't compete with it, as while they were very well executed, neither of them were really super inventive. For the first finalist, we are pairing The Maid and the Crocodile against Of Monsters and Mainframes, which just kind of defaults to The Maid and the Crocodile because one of them was 5 stars and one of them was 4.5 stars. For the second finalist, this was definitely the hardest decision of the entire book bracket. Both When Among Crows and The Six Deaths of the Saints are kind of stories I really love. They both deal a lot with religious indoctrination and breaking free of that, and do it through a really interesting fantasy lens. Both of them are on the shorter side. Both of them are written with a very beautiful style. In the end, the characters are really what put When Among Crows slightly over The Six Deaths of the Saint. Since The Six Deaths is so short, we only got to know our POV character really, and the way the story is told still keeps us somewhat from knowing her fully. While with When Among Crows, I felt like I knew all of 3 of the main characters pretty intimately. Finally, between The Maid and the Crocodile and When Among Crows won, and the thing that edged it out is just the themes of When Among Crows are themes that really pierce my heart in a way that is very specific. So When Among Crows was ultimately my favorite read of the year. And now a full flip through of my entire 2025 reading journal. Here's my page tracker all filled in, then my release radar. I only ended up having to use the backside in 1 month, which was October. My book tracker with all the covers, the lovely book bracket we just filled in, my 25 in 2025, which I failed. I read 14 of 25, and my series in DNF tracker. I ended up writing some soft DNFs in the graveyard, which I regret. I wish I would have just kept it to hard DNFs. My physical TBR tracker and library savings. I ended up having to add this little flip for the library savings, but I ended up saving $541.67 by using the library. And then my book club tracker that went unused because the book club I was going to track was disbanded in March, and I didn't find a different one during the year. And then my traveling book club tracker with all the books I've gotten so far. And now I'll leave you to chill as I flip through the rest of the pages. Popping in really quickly just to say this is my favorite intro page of the journal. Okay, bye. Enjoy the rest. And with that, we've reached the end of my 2025 reading journal. If you haven't seen yet, I also have a video about my 2026 reading journal setup in case you're curious about that. And I also have a full flip through of my 2024 reading journal if you want to see another fully finished journal. Other than that, thanks for hanging out with me while I finish this journal up, and I'll see you again next time.